Hello everyone, welcome to what is pre-lecture 6. Just a reminder that if you would like to get notified whenever I post these, you can subscribe to the channel, and if not, the links will always be posted on Blackboard. So, getting into the chemistry here. Maybe, we'll see if I can actually go forward. These are the things that you should know by the end of this class, essentially identifying different types of orbitals, their shapes. Then we have some different rules. So we have something called the Aufbau principle, Hund's rules, Pauli exclusion principle. Talk about those in the pre-lecture video in class, and then also identifying quantum numbers. Okay. So just to pick up from where we left off last class, we discussed ionization energy, the amount of energy needed to remove an electron from an atom in order to make an ion. And so we had some trends here. We also had our shell model. And that shell model, of course, describes the different energy levels that exist within atoms, and our outermost shell contains our electrons that we consider to be valence electrons, right? So, moving on to class today, how can we better describe electrons yet? And in particular, how do they fill those shells and provide us with some more detail on their location and shape? So, unsurprisingly, we can go to the periodic table for some help. And we have different kinds of orbitals that are grouped on the periodic table. So on our first two columns, we have s orbitals. You'll notice that each s orbital is capable of holding 2 electrons, right? If we go to the other side of the periodic table here, this right side, we have p orbitals. And I will tell you that we have 3 p orbitals, and each of those p orbitals is also capable of holding 2 electrons each, so we have 3 different kinds of p orbitals to hold 6 electrons total. Working our way down the periodic table, we have d orbitals. Hopefully you're picking up the pattern here that each of these d orbitals can hold 2 electrons, and we have 5 d orbitals to hold 10 electrons. Then finally our f orbitals that can hold 2 electrons each, and we have 7 d orbitals for a total of 14 electrons that can fill that subshell. Okay. To give you a little bit better idea of the shape of these, our s orbital is always spherical, so it looks just kind of like our shells that we've been looking at. But if we switch to something like p orbitals, those actually have a little bit of a different shape. So they kind of look like a dumbbell here, where we have directionality. So if we put an x, y, and z axis here, this would be our p orbital along the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. And things only get kind of busier from there. So if we look at our 5 d orbitals, we've got kind of another dumbbell, but with a donut around it this time. And we have basically double dumbbells for the rest of our d orbitals, which, yeah, it's interesting, and you should be able to identify the shapes of these orbitals. So if I gave you something like this, you should know that it's a d orbital instead of a p, basically. Okay, so we've got our different orbitals. So if we're filling these orbitals with electrons as we go across the periodic table, we need to follow something called the Aufbau principle. And this states that electrons fill the atomic orbitals at the lowest available energy level before occupying any sort of higher energy level. So that means that we're going to put electrons in 1s orbitals before we put them in 2s orbitals, before we put them in 2p orbitals, before we get to 3s, 3p, 4s, and so on and so on. Okay? So you can always remember this diagram to help. Essentially what we're doing here is just working our way across rows on the periodic table. Okay? We also have Hund's rule, and so Hund's rule essentially says that every orbital is only capable of holding 2 electrons, and before we fill a subshell, we have to, or before we pair any electrons, we have to at least partially fill all of our orbitals. So this is basically a Hund's rule example here, where instead of pairing electrons like we would do here, also I should tell you that we tend to represent electrons with up arrows and down arrows. And so before pairing them, we want to basically fill in our p orbitals. And this is how we would fill all of our p orbitals based on the different number of electrons that we have. Okay? Finally, we also have the Pauli exclusion principle, and that states that no two electrons can have the same quantum numbers. And we're going to talk about those in a second, but this is in part where our property of spin up or spin down comes from, and that's what we represent with our up arrows or our down arrows. So let's talk a little bit more about quantum numbers. And every electron is going to have 4 quantum numbers, one of each of these. And so the n quantum number is essentially what we discussed last class. It is the principal quantum number, it describes the energy shell that our electron resides in. Which will also be the row of the periodic table generally, although when you get to d and f orbitals, that is not always the case. Next up, we have the quantum number L, and L is what describes our type of orbital. So L can be anything from 0 up to our n quantum number minus 1. And so, say for example, we have an L quantum number of 1. That means that we have a p orbital. If we have L equal to 0, it's an s orbital, 2 is d, and 3 is f. Okay. Next up, we have our m sub L quantum number, and that describes the orientation. So if you remember how our p orbitals had a px, a py, and a pz, m sub L helps us differentiate between those. And so m sub L numbers can be plus or minus whatever L is. So for example, again, thinking of our p orbitals, if L is equal to 1, which it is for p orbitals, then m sub L can be plus 1, 0, or minus 1. Okay. Finally, we have m sub s, and this is our quantum number that relates to spin. And so I put spin in quotes there because electrons aren't actually spinning, but they have this property where they are either seem to be pointing one way or another. And so for m sub s, it's always going to be either plus 1/2 or minus 1/2. And we default to doing spin 1/2 if we only have one electron, but it can be either. Okay. And so these are essentially just those rules, just rewritten, but hopefully you recognize those rules, and we'll of course practice that in class some. Okay. One last thing to kind of go over here are just pretty pictures. So these are what orbitals look like. And in the bottom right corner of this graphic here are the quantum numbers that would lead to that orbital. And so you can appreciate those that were collected from actual experimental data. So that's all for class today. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in office hours or in class.